Well, thank you to Adam, and thank you to the Philosophy Society for inviting me. Thank you to Michael for being here and so on. I need to explain why I'm here. It's not a philosophical question, it's just physically why I'm here. Sinead here, sitting here, was supposed to be the speaker, and then she contacted me and said, actually, I saw the topic, which was proof of God or God, something like that, and I realized it wouldn't be very entertaining since I'm a Buddhist atheist. And so she said, would I do it? I said, yeah, but you see, I also have a similar difficulty because it's not an absolute requirement for us to believe in God either. So, and of all the 6 philosophies under the umbrella of Vedanta, the authentic word for Hinduism really, the 6 formal philosophers or approaches, 5 of them are atheistic. So I'm sure we'll find something to fight about though. So let me just start then by giving a few reservations a little bit. Firstly, this is my first debate ever because we don't view argumentation as very productive. Cavilling, arguing, we don't see much point in it. Secondly, we have no agenda because you're quite entitled to be an atheist or a non-atheist. We don't care. We have no proselytizing mission to convert anybody, and we think every position is pretty valid. Having said that, I also have a difficulty with the title, because if you ask me, does God or a God exist? Technically, I have to answer no. And the reason is because it's awkwardly phrased. If you were to phrase it, is God existence? I could answer it. And that brings us to kind of definition of what is God, from my point of view, from our point of view. So, God is existence itself. That's the way we define it. And we go back to the original entities who defined this, but they didn't define it intellectually. These people, we call them rishis, sages, they decided that the old religion of varying gods and so on and so forth was fine, but what we have to do is start afresh, green fields, and we want a definite inquiry about the nature of the truth. So the Hindu mind says if there is a God, we want to see such a thing. We want to experience it firsthand. If there's a soul, we want to feel it. If there's a God, we want to experience directly and immediately. Directly and immediately is not how we experience the world. We don't experience the world directly. We experience it through the sense organs and the mind. And nor do we experience it immediately. It takes some time for light particles, photons to come hit you, come to my eye, and then a kind of registration, oh, I see it's you, and so on. All of that takes time. It takes 8 minutes for the sun's light to reach us, and so on. So there's nothing immediate about it. These great philosophers, scientists actually, because Vedanta means the science of religion. And they postulate that religion can be approached in exactly as scientific way as even modern science approaches it. In fact, anything short of that would not be satisfactory. Now, in terms of proof, there's only one proof, direct experience. There's no other proof. And what it suggests is that there is such a thing as subjective empirical evidence. We are familiar with objective empirical evidence. This says there's subjective empirical evidence. And the other difficulty I have with the title is this. It's not a good starting point for us. We don't start by saying, I'm here, where's God? That's not a good question in Hinduism. The good question is this. We take nothing for granted except one thing, I exist. Now, if that's not true, then a non-existent me is talking with a non-existent Michael and a non-existent yourselves on a non-existent subject, so that doesn't work. So we take for granted a priori at least this much, I exist. Then the next question is, given that that is so, the next question, who am I, what am I? And that's a relentless question that has to go to the heart of it, stripping away every vestige of unreality. I have to define what is reality for us. Reality in this sense is something that is unchanging and something that is permanent. So you may think that these two are the same thing. They're not. I'll give you an example. Supposing some creature appears before us and it looks like a puppy, then it looks like a kitten, and then it looks like a weasel. We cannot really know it. So then the next question is, how do you know it? Supposing an elephant suddenly appears in the room and then disappears. Can we know it? Can we say that this is a truth, a reality? We don't. And so on that basis, from that strict definition, the search is to look for something that is real, something that is enduring, something that is the same today, yesterday, and tomorrow, and something that is substantial meaning, that it is thought that there are various qualities, names and forms and so on and so forth, but underneath that will be a substance. In other words, a unity behind all existence that science itself today is looking for, and finding it maybe in various theories, superstring theory and so on and so forth, but not quite there yet. The search for the theory of everything, unified field theory and so on and so forth, is this desire to get to some overall fundamental underlying generalization. So when we have found the absolute generalization of who we are, we now have found the generalized identity of what is behind the whole universe, the whole of existence. Just as if you ask a pot, who are you?
Just in a minute.
Yeah, thank you. It might declare, I'm a pot, but the truth is, of course, I am clay. I was clay, I am clay, I will always be clay. And that's the difference between the substance. So that's the search for it, and because of time I'll leave it there. But just to define, because I can't stop without defining quickly, what we call God really is something that is undivided, something that is unchanging, something that is infinite. And the term for it would be Satchitananda, that is existence, consciousness, and bliss. And even with that we give an apology, because this God has no personality, it has no gender. We call it tat, a neutral term, it means it. And even that we give an apology. The mind, in the senses, comes back, says the Upanishads, together the senses, declaring we don't know what this is, but we empirically can know it. And I need to expand on that as we go on, but I think that's enough due to the time restriction. Good.
I'll just tap it once when it means that there's a minute left, and tap it twice when the time's wrong.
Great, thank you. Right.
Okay. Okay, I'll address this in two ways. I'll start off with just general discussion about the concept of God as people understand it from different perspectives, and then I'll come back to the version that you were talking about. When people talk about God, they can mean different things. Some people mean whatever it was that caused the universe to exist. And typically it's a being that using the theistic rather than deistic version of God, it's a being that humans on planet Earth can have some sort of an individual personal relationship with. It's also the source of morality for a lot of people. That the idea that a God exists is not merely a claim about the nature of reality, it's also a claim about the nature of morality. And to that extent, atheism is not merely a claim or a denial about a claim about the nature of reality. Atheism is also an assertion about the nature of morality. And that's significant because it's the idea of gods typically have this baggage attached, that it's not just the same thing as saying, I believe that there is a pink unicorn outside the building here. Because whether or not there is has no real bearing on how we live our lives. Whereas whether a God, in the sense that most people in the Western world understand a God to be, exists, does have a bearing on how we live our lives. Then there are other variations of what people mean by God, which is the more kind of impersonal force, which can almost be equated to nature, which in the context of the earlier statement that you made here in terms of being existence, sounds to me like just a placeholder name for something we already have a name for. But I'll come on to a more detailed version later on. I think that if you're talking about the idea of a God as either another name for something we already have a word for, or as a placeholder name for, or placeholder word for something that we don't yet understand, they're kind of very different concepts of God than the concept of a God as a personal being that intervenes in nature and typically does so out of 100 billion galaxies, each of which has 100 billion stars like our sun, typically does so for the benefit of human beings on planet Earth, on one of the planets revolving one of those billions of stars. Now that seems to me to be a very implausible scenario. I think that the belief in that type of God corrupts our sense of reality and corrupts our sense of morality. If I was to say to you here now that I was talking to Bill Gates of Microsoft earlier on today, and he's going to give each of you $10 million if you vote with me on this motion tonight, you'd know instinctively that I'm not telling the truth. You just know that because you compare it with your evidence of how the world works, and it's quite possible. In fact, it's more possible than the existence of a God. But you just instinctively know that it's not true. Because what we do typically, we decide whether claims are true by assessing the evidence, and as claims become increasingly implausible, we raise the bar of the evidence that we need in order to allow ourselves to believe that claim. But with religion we do the opposite. As the claims become increasingly implausible, we lower the bar of evidence that we require ourselves to have in order to believe it. And we end up believing things that are not merely implausible, but that are untestable. And then on the basis of these beliefs in untestable claims, we decide how we're going to live our lives, and then even further we decide how we're going to tell other people to live their lives. And so to that extent it corrupts both our sense of reality and our sense of morality. And the problem is not really the idea of God per se. The problem is faith. The problem is believing things disproportionately to the currently best available evidence. And actually, I'm not suggesting you're doing this, because your version actually sounds a lot closer to evidence-based. At least parts of it seem closer to evidence-based than the claims of gods that other people will make. So I think it's important to distinguish between those two things. And if the concept to which you're attaching the label God is the concept that you're talking about, if one accepts that exists, whatever it may be, there's no bridge from that to a lot of the claims about morality and claims for, as I can understand from this, two claims about how we should live our lives, simply because there is something that is undivided, unchanging, infinite. If that exists, that has no real bearing. Presumably something like that does exist. That doesn't seem particularly controversial, other than the unchanging. But even if something like that did exist, it's not something around which to build a worldview. It's an opinion about something that might exist that is based on direct experience is I think what you said, and to be honest, direct experience is probably the worst way to assess the nature of reality, because direct experience is subject to our mistaken minds. If we say that something is real based on what we feel or what we think, we're in a kind of circular thing that we're assessing the reliability of our minds in interpreting what we think we experience, but ultimately the mechanism that we're using to assess the reliability of our mind in assessing that is our mind. So it's like trying to measure something with a ruler and then test the reliability of the accuracy of the ruler by using the same ruler to measure something else. So to that extent, I think the bottom line is we have to be cautious about what we believe, and the most appropriate way to be cautious about what we believe is to believe things that are independently verifiable by different people based on the same evidence.
Yeah, this is just the rebuttals basically coming back, and if anyone has a question, just raise your hand, and if you want to accept. Yeah, that's fine.
Yes.
Just a question about the last thing you said. You were saying that about direct experience being the worst way to assess reality due to the unreliability of the mind. Could you say a bit more about that? Why the mind can't be trusted?
Well, because because if we're relying on direct experience, what we're doing is we're using our mind to test the reliability of our mind. So if our mind is flawed, then our testing using our mind may also be flawed. So it's, as I said, it's like trying to measure the accuracy of a ruler using the same ruler. The best, I mean, I would have a different definition of reality than unchanging and permanent. I think reality is just all that is reality, and it's also whatever it is, independently of whether we think it is there or not. It's, things either exist or don't exist, regardless of whether we believe they exist or don't exist. There is a factual truth as to whether there is a God, which of course varies depending what definition you put on it. But the most reliable way that we have found for assessing the nature of reality is the scientific method, which is you come up with a hypothesis and you test it against evidence, and if it meets with the evidence, then you're not saying that it's true, but that it's coming closer to understanding that it's true. But if it doesn't meet with the evidence, then you're mistaken, and you reevaluate. And that allows everybody to test the claims of reality based on just independent criteria. And again, that doesn't bring us anywhere. The big difference, I think, between science-based approach to understanding reality and faith-based approaches to understanding reality is that with science progresses by trying to prove itself wrong. That's where you get brownie points in science, is by proving something wrong, and that rules out something that people thought might be true. And science has consistently shown that it works in a way that religious claims and faith-based claims haven't.
In terms of concept of God, maybe I should get a little bit started, and then we come back with questions. Is that okay? So, because I have a list of notes here as you were talking. When you talk of the English word God, I think we can trace it back to the Germanic hut, and that goes back to the Indo-European language Sanskrit, mother of all languages, by the way, in which this Vedic system is written. Now, that goes back to the word hutam, something worth offering to. And I suppose there are two varieties of that. One variety I'll come to now, but the other variety is a God made in our own image and likeness. And it seems to me that this is the kind of God that, when you talk of concepts of God, you might be talking about. If it's atheism about that kind of God, I entirely agree. But is it necessary? I think it has its place. Because how I define God as this entity which is existence and consciousness and bliss, how do you get from an abstract entity like that, with no personality, no gender, nothing like that, to the human relationship, to understanding how we get to grips with such a thing? And the only way to do it with really is language and concepts. And if we have to formulate concepts, so be it. And so everybody will have their own concepts, and maybe there'll be 7 billion concepts of the same thing. But this entity, as seen by us, in other words, the highest reading of this absolutely human mind, is what we call God with quality. So now I'm putting forward, I'm extending what I originally said, and said, the first thing is what we call Nirguna Brahman. It means, and Brahman is a very interesting technical term, not God. Because Brahman means something that pervades everywhere, and something that is infinitely expanding, and even that we give an apology, because this is our terminology for it. Now, how do we read it through the human mind, and how do we read it through the prism, if you like, of time-space causation function? There we come across a God with quality. This is akin to the God of religion as you normally would have it. And it's by relating to that and also devising ways. The ways we would call ploys. In other words, your image of God is a ploy. And that's how, as soon as you recognize that, and don't know more than that, then you don't get into trouble. You don't get into a violent situation. My God is better than yours. My nose is better than yours on the grounds it's mine. That kind of thing, what I call nosism. So that's the one thing I would like to point out in terms of concept. In terms of morality issue, in terms of a placeholder name, you realize this is not just a placeholder name, and if it's a suggestion that nature is this, no, this is not pantheism. It's more akin to panentheism, it's more akin to Spinoza's point of view, and Spinoza was not a pantheist in my view. So it's saying that there's a realm of time and space. I entirely agree that direct perception for the relative world is unreliable. Now, we know it's unreliable, scientifically we know it's unreliable, because all we have is uncertainty as a foundation of our reality. And this is because of general relativity and quantum physics. And uncertainty underlines both of them. So with that in mind, it simply goes back to this old idea, this ancient idea that always was there, that what is real, or what we take to be real, is actually a mere apparition. And here's where these philosophers understood the world to be apparent. How can we prove it? Well, apart from the latest understandings of quantum physics, where we see things appearing and disappearing, things entirely incoherent, and using representational classical language for it, apart from that, their experience was, when I go and experience this entity, this existence as it is, what happens? The world disappears from me, and I cannot describe it. Now, the problem is that everybody who goes there, as it were, cannot describe it. And yet, and they say, we can't say anything about it. What's the first thing they do? They try and say something about it. And so, as soon as they say something about it, they'll have to couch it in the language that is familiar to those around them. So if it's, for example, Jesus, he may have gotten a transcendent experience. I don't think it would go down well in the Jewish community to say, I just had a transcendent experience about the nature of existence and all the rest of it. He would have to say, your Father in heaven, something along those language, and give hints to those immediate disciples. Now, the evolution of religion is something like that. So what happens from there is people then not understanding it, not having seen it, framing it in the human context, want to design something with strictures. So how does the Vedantas view it? And the wonderful Vedantist Swami Vivekananda summarized it like this: each soul is potentially divine. Now, what that means is, when I say that this Brahman is existent, it's your own very nature. It's your divine entity. It's your own inner essence. So what that means is, if you say God exists, it's your inner essence saying it. If you say it doesn't exist, it's your inner essence saying it. You can't get away from it. So each soul is potentially divine, he declared, and the goal is to manifest that divinity from within. Then he goes on, do this by various means, work, worship, and so on. These are important methodologies. Psychic control, philosophy, one or more, all of these, and be free. Then he goes on to say, churches, temples, rituals, doctrines, dogmas, books are all but secondary details. Now it strikes me that if this is true, and if we ourselves discover this, and if we take on the testimony of those people who say they did experience it, then it seems to me a highly converging thing as opposed to diverging thing. The criteria, by the way, for discovery of truth in this system is threefold. If I could just finish off that sentence.
Yeah, you can't leave it at that.
It would be direct experience would be the thing I already mentioned. Reliable testimony. In other words, testimony from those who say they've experienced it and show evidence that they have. And thirdly, it has to be rational. It has to have inference or deductive reasoning, preferably both. And truth is only truth when all of those three are present. If one is missing, we can't say it's true. And that's the way we would measure it. There are other points I make, but I'll carry on according to the time. Yeah.
Okay, this is actually quite a more interesting discussion now than some of the discussions on gods that I have. Let's take your original point when you say you start off with I exist as the starting point. I think that's assuming too much. I think the most that we can assume is that what appears to be something seems to exist. I don't think we can bring I into it, other than as another assumption. And the most that we can, so there are various things, places along the scale of a spectrum of it. You could start off with everything as illusory, including I. Now I don't know how that would be, but it's a possibility. Everything is illusory and that there's no I. Through to that I exist as a conscious entity, through to I and other conscious thinking entities exist, through to all of those, or any permutation of those plus physical objects, through to all of those things. So we don't know which of those is reality for the reason that I was talking about earlier on, that we cannot know because we only have our minds to test whether what the apparent evidence of our senses is telling our minds is real or not. So where do you come in terms of assumptions? And I think the kind of on-off switch, for want of a better word, is to assume that something actually exists, that it's not all illusory. So that something exists. Now I'm not saying that that's I think that's a step too far for the original step. But I think then what you would say is you'd say, well, how do we determine that it... Now we have to make that assumption, then we have to build on that to some extent in order to function sanely in what seems to be the world. So I think the criteria that we use as the next step is what appears to be most consistent with applying reason to the apparent evidence of my senses. Now, wherever that leads you, that's I think the test that I would start with, and that probably leads you to possibly an I as a working assumption. But I don't think that's necessarily the case because we don't know. It's one of the three big things that we don't yet know scientifically is the nature of consciousness. So we're making assumptions as to the I existing. The other two being what happened before the Big Bang, if there is a before in terms of Big Bang, or if there is. Well, I think. Okay, in terms of assumptions of the test of applying reason to the apparent evidence.
Now.
I'm happy to. I mean, let's...
Yeah. Well, you know what, let's just do 7 minutes, 20 minutes, just dialogue between you two.
Yeah, okay. Okay, well, I'll just finish this train of thought first of all. But yes, so something exists, and on that basis, I think that our next test should be, obviously we have to function, so we have to assume some things. But we have to differentiate between whether we're speaking strictly philosophically, in which case we're saying that we can't know anything for certain, or in day-to-day language when we say I know something or I believe something. We have all sort of unspoken caveats. I mean, essentially, if you say you know something, you're saying in an unspoken caveats, you're saying based on applying reason to the evidence of my senses, based on the possibility that I might be mistaken. This is my current working assumption. But I think that you've got to be cautious in where you go with that. So you're cautious about what you believe, and that's why I will assume that this table exists. I will assume that my house exists. I will assume that my house will still be there when I go home. You know, these are things that enable me to function. But I'm not going to assume that unnecessary things to assume. And I think bringing these things into the realms of bringing in these things of each soul is potentially divine. Temples are secondary details to whatever that is. combining the ideas of existence and consciousness and bliss. You know, these are all very interesting theories, but I'm not going to believe them unless I've positive reason to believe them.
Absolutely, and that really is where the Hindu mind takes you. So, but you see, you have made some assumptions too that this table exists.
Yeah, a working assumption.
And for practical purposes, no one can deny it. You can't be say as a quantum physicist, or I'll go to a carpenter and say, but by the way, it doesn't, you know, it's only waves of possibilities. You know, you need something concrete to work with. There's no doubt about that. But you see, you stumbled on a good method, because what you said was exactly the method that is being used here by these sages. And the method was to use your discrimination to find out what in fact is real. In other words, what is not related to the senses, to the mind, or any of these things that can sway it. I mean, we have uncertainty only on account that we can no longer rely on the sensory perception because of two things. We have the speed of light, and that restricts what we can see. We can only see 15 billion light years away. And secondly, we're restricted by the uncertainty principle. Now, when you take this now into this context, when you perceive something, two things are necessary: the perceiver and the perceived. And if you have to have three rules about that. First rule is the perceiver and the perceived, or the known and the knower, are separate and different. You test it out. I'm seeing the audience here. I'm seeing you. Clearly, my eyes are different from what I'm seeing. Secondly, the field in front is multiple. There are many things. And thirdly, it's changing. So anybody can understand that very easily. But you can't stop at that inquiry. What is it that observes the eye? I can see the eye, one moment is scratchy, one moment it's refreshed, and so on and so forth. So you go, well, there's a mind that may perceive it. A mind being a generic term for a whole lot of components. And then you say, well, what observes the mind? Eventually you go to a datum where you can no longer go. Otherwise, it's an infinite regress. And this is the datum that it goes to a seer that can never be seen. Its job is not to be seen, its job is to see. I don't suppose anybody here has seen their eyeballs. Anybody? You've seen it in the mirror and so on, but the eye cannot see itself. The mind cannot see itself. And ultimately the self cannot see itself. It is this self really that is the discovery. And so that's why I said at the beginning, looking for God was not a good starting point for us. We find out, is there a reality called me? Is there an I? Because there's an I consciousness somewhere. So what is the nature of that?
Well, actually, before you go into what is the nature of it, I would dispute the clearly part of that sentence. You're assuming that there is an I somewhere.
No.
It not only could it be, but I mean there is scientific evidence that suggests that it may be the case that there isn't an I, and that what we are doing, or there isn't an I in the context of consciously doing things. There may be an I in the context of noticing that things are happening. There's one thing in terms of this, just before we go too far down the quantum physics road, is if you're talking about quantum physics, and I'm uncomfortable with discussions of quantum physics being used to justify religious beliefs. And the reason I'm uncomfortable with it is that what we know about quantum physics comes from the field of science. And you can't just cherry pick something out of the field of science and say the uncertainty principle applies to this, that, or the other, because the uncertainty principle in the context of quantum physics applies to subatomic particles. It doesn't carry through to subatomic particles combining together into atoms and medium-sized objects and planets. So you can't just take something that science gives a limited credence to and apply it to an entirely different field in a different scale of existence. And the other thing I'd just like to ask you, in terms of and I genuinely mean this is a very interesting discussion when I say this.
Yeah.
I'm really enjoying this discussion. I think it's very interesting, but I don't think there is any bridge whatsoever from what we're talking about to souls, reincarnations, temples being secondary details of something that we don't even know is there. I mean, they seem to be just entirely separate things that are given apparent justification by the conversation that we're having. But you need a bridge in order to justify those. You need a bridge from the conversation that we're having to the idea that a soul exists, the idea that souls reincarnate, the idea that they could reincarnate to other non-human animals or to divine beings. All of these things are interesting speculation, but they're entirely disconnected from what we've been talking about today.
Well, if you want to explore that and so on and so forth, I mean, what you could say soul is the spirit or this I identity that we're talking about, but it does create some confusion, because Western language soul really is, until fairly recently, to do with the psyche more than anything else. But if you say spirit to avoid confusion, we have a technical term for it. It means Atman, which simply translates as self. Now, if you say that you are, I'm assuming that there's an ultimate datum beyond which we cannot go. I don't think that's an assumption. I think you can analyze that and come to that conclusion. And when you say we're extrapolating quantum physics, I don't think we are, because the whole nature of the quantum physics really is the conscious observer, albeit that there are other interpretations for the wave collapse, there's no doubt.
Yeah, but at a subatomic level. It doesn't carry through into the world in which, or the scale
well,
in which
I would dispute that. I would dispute that.
Well, science wouldn't.
Or I think science would dispute it, because the very thorough evidence, experiments by Greenberg and so on, have experienced this quantum principle of non-locality and discontinuity and all of those kinds of things. And there's very good data about it. Now,
but it doesn't carry through to. It's
still
carries
talking
through
to black holes. It carries through to the Big Bang.
It doesn't carry through to me and you talking to each other.
Oh, I believe it does.
Okay, well, but on what basis do you believe it does?
On the basis that the whole elemental physics, when we say subatomic and so on and so forth, all we're saying is a fundamental layer of existence. And if you say, and if you talk to some physicists, such as the atheist Short Carroll, who will say, actually, the dispute between waves and particles, what is that? Well, he'll say, actually, don't say it's particles, it's actually waves, but as seen by us, it's particles. In other words, it requires our limited interception to say that this is the familiar world we're in. We have this limitation of only 5 photographs of the universe, and beyond that we don't know. And so is it an apparitional? You yourself mentioned the word appearance, see? So, and you said in one sentence, appears to be real. These are two contradictory statements. If it's apparent, it's not real. So
okay, seems to us to be real, if we exist.
Yeah, it's exactly the same language. Seems to us to be real is apparitional language. Now this then comes back to, are there two causations, transformational causation and apparitional causation? And what we would say is, and I would think at the quantum physics level people would concur, but I don't see it as a microscopic level, as a micro atomic level only applicable there. Otherwise, why would you want to reconcile quantum gravity? Why would you want to reconcile general relativity with quantum physics? This is the biggest issue in science today.
Well, why people want to reconcile them is trying to understand reality. I mean, it's a desire to know more, to satiate our curiosity about what we can know.
It's more than curiosity. It's a vital question.
Well, it's a vital question for you and me because we're interested in it, but I tell you, there's many people, the vast majority of people wandering around the world have not the slightest interest in it and don't consider it to be a vital question.
And a great many quantum physicists also are not bothered with it. So,
but then it's not vital. Well, it's subjectively vital to those who believe it to be vital. The fact that
they don't see it as important doesn't mean to say it's vital. It's vital from this point of view that it's the most outstanding question in physics today. And while it may not affect the ordinary person, is what you're saying, and I would agree, but still, if you're asking for evidence of an apparitional world, this is what I'm supplying. apart from anything else. So if you say that these ancient people would say that in contrast to what we seem to be there has to be something which doesn't change, doesn't move, which is able to observe the changing and the moving. Otherwise, how would you register that something moves or changes? This is only the theory of relativity also. See? So that something remains static in relation to its moving counterpart. Now, if you say that, then you are then acknowledging something that is unchanging, something that is existing, not seeming to exist, but acknowledging that there's an apparitional world. Now,
So what do you mean at the start of that, though? When you say that you're assuming there is something that is unchanging and unmoving.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but that's an assumption. Why do you
no, it's not an
what
assumption.
do you build that on?
Well, because if something moves, how is it registered?
I'm not sure what you think. Look, forget about moving for a second. You're saying there is something unmoving.
No. Let's deal with it. A river moves.
Yeah.
There's a solid bank behind, and there's an entity.
Well, there's not a solid bank. There's what appears to us to be a solid bank.
I mean, it's only it's only a metaphor.
Okay.
All metaphors are flawed.
Okay. But no, let's go off the metaphor moving. Let's go back to the something unchanging, unmoving. Where are you getting that from?
Well, let's go back to the river. I must be non-flowing to observe the flowing.
No, that's not
if I'm
true at all. You could be moving and observe the flowing relative to your motion if the flowing is different to your movement.
Exactly, absolutely. So there's a relativity where I'm relatively static in comparison to that. Now supposing...
Hang on. You're jumping off things there. What we're saying, is there something unmoving? Your evidence for there being something unmoving was that if the river is moving and I'm stationary, then it's moving relative to me. I said, no, you are actually moving. Both things are moving. So now, where is the unmoving thing in this?
Well, you see, in the original analysis that I did, which started off with various fields that are observed, I started with the eyes. The eyes are moving relative to what they're seeing. But as you go back and inward, then that relativity of perception becomes less and less, and the multiple fields become more and more. So that ultimately you'll come to a position where nothing moves.
No, you don't. The final part of that doesn't follow from the earlier parts.
Why not?
Well, you have to justify why it does. I mean, because whatever it is, if you're talking about the eye, and I presume you mean the physical eye and the eye in terms of the mind.
Yeah.
Well, you and all the eyes, they're moving around the universe at great speeds all the time.
Right.
Well, there's no point just saying right. I mean, it is moving.
Well, there's no point in saying right, because you haven't said anything profound in there. You see, when things are changing and moving in the physical world, we understand that. What we don't understand is there a single datum that will register it beyond which you cannot go? Now that's a question. So I put it in.
But how do you get from that question to that there is something unmoving, unchanging, which is existence and consciousness and bliss?
Because if it is,
why isn't it hatred?
Well, why would it be changing? If it's changing,
no. Why do you bring in bliss instead of hatred?
Oh, okay.
You know, but they simply random subjective preferences.
No, they're not. But we only have several minutes to present an intricate topic. Why we said bliss is because there are no two. It's undivided. If something is undivided, then we don't have any conflict. For example, in a dreamless sleep, we experience no division, and we register there's a peace.
But conflict only exists in the context of consciousness. In the context of conscious beings. If there was no consciousness, then there would be no morality. There would be no conflict.
Well,
there would just be things.
Well. You're using a word which can mean various things. So I think we need to find out what is consciousness. Consciousness.
We won't do that tonight.
No, we don't.
But
there's a difference between consciousness, and if you're confusing the two terms.
Also, and which is the God, conscious or consciousness?
Consciousness
is the
would
God.
be equivalent to God, yes.
Okay, consciousness is God. But it's consciousness and also bliss.
Yes, bliss because it's undivided.
Okay, now what happens to consciousness that is divided? Where does that fit in the overall scheme?
Then that's in the apparitional world of transformational causation.
Okay, and is consciousness plus bliss in the same world?
Yes, because it's undivided.
So there are two things then, there's consciousness plus bliss and there's consciousness plus hatred.
Then
there's also consciousness plus any other series
no pluses, no pluses. These are three different aspects of one entity. With the apology, we can't fully describe it.
Okay, so there are different aspects of the... Can we just have a few minutes on this, because I think this is kind of useful. So now we've got that there are multiple aspects of the same entity. So why out of those multiple aspects... Seemingly. Why out of those seemingly multiple aspects do you choose bliss as the one to describe it? Why don't you say it's consciousness plus multiple aspects, one of which is bliss? Why do you choose bliss? I suspect, and just follow the train of thought, because I suspect this is one of the things that is now coming closer to what I do experience with other religious discussions, is that religious faith seems to me to be not only, it's not just that you're believing things disproportionately to the available evidence, but it's you're believing things because you want to believe them. And it's nicer to believe that there's consciousness and bliss than it is to believe that there's consciousness and hatred. Because if God is consciousness and hatred, then that doesn't sound very nice.
I think you're completely misunderstanding the whole thing. I'm
following the logic of what you're saying.
You see, if there's a dividedness, then there's a second entity to hate. I'm not saying that there is happiness with something or something objective in relation to happiness or anything like that. I'm saying that these are essences. In other words, existence is itself. It's not something that is objectively existent. Consciousness is something that is...
Well, it exists...
that is objectively so.
Okay, to take a step back from that...
And bliss is because there's an undividedness.
Okay. Well, let's take those one at a time. Existence is
more than undividedness, but I'll go into that.
Again, you're making assumptions there. Existence, philosophically, is arguably a property of things rather than an entity in itself.
Well,
secondly,
not so in this case.
Not so in this case. In your opinion,
no. Something. If something is moving and changing, and something in relation to it is unchanging, and you have an observer for that, you ultimately go to a datum where there's only existence.
Yeah, but you have a lot of ifs. You have a lot of ifs along the way of that route, and the first if, which I would dispute, is if there is something that is unchanging.
No, that's not at all. No, there's no if.
You included an if when you were saying, you said if there is something that's unchanging.
Okay.
So that's the stage beyond which I can't follow you until I'm satisfied that part is true. And even if we go, and I think because I don't think we're going to resolve a lot of these issues. So I'd like to just move on to the next part of it, which is even if we assume for the sake of this discussion that we do go that as far as you have gone, there's still no bridge that I can see between that and the caste system, the idea that people are reincarnated, all of the beliefs that were described.
If that's a subject matter, then we could. But that wasn't the subject matter.
It is to the extent that for the existence of God to mean anything, in the context of I mean, you're a member of a religion, okay? In the context of the real world as we perceive it to be, for the existence of God to mean something other than the existence of a bottle of water, that there are moral and lifestyle implications of it, and that's where even if you accept that this abstract entity, which is less problematic than some of the theistic ideas of a being that intervenes on a daily basis for the benefit of human beings on planet Earth. It's less problematic than that, but it is still just a nice thing to talk about, you know, to have a few drinks at night and chat about, and wouldn't it be interesting if? But you're using it as the basis of your worldview.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. The reason why it's workable, because I'm glad you brought that up, because you mentioned this also in your rebuttal. You're talking about what's the connection, and I understand what you're saying. See, the connection is this. If I but if I have evidence, and the evidence is based from reliable testimony, ultimately my personal experience and rationale, if this evidence says that this world, and from modern science as well, that this world is merely apparitional, there's no substantial aspect to it, then I will deal with the world in a different way. I won't assume it's permanent. I won't assume that there's a necessity for fear. And this is the goal of Vedanta, and I'm glad we got to this point. The goal of the Vedanta is fearlessness. It's not heaven. Heaven has no relation to this. The heaven is, if there is a heaven in terms of the theology of it, it's a very poor reward. It's a kind of return ticket that is not desirable. So the goal is freedom, and every atom of the universe and everything is moving and wants to move toward this freedom, and expresses itself in aspects like social freedom, freedom of gender, freedom of political views, and so on and so forth, all of these kinds of things.
Are you attributing consciousness and desires to atoms?
No, I'm not.
Because you just said that.
Well, I said what?
You just said that.
What?
You said that. Yes, no, you said every atom has a desire for freedom.
Every atom seems to want to have its own freedom.
Yeah, but we know that. Well, insofar as we can know anything, we know that atoms don't desire anything.
Well, atoms are under the influence of a desire, and I'll frame it in poetic language, admittedly, to expand and go on infinitely. If it wasn't for that, this force of electrical energy wouldn't be there. So, as I see it, the three great energies in the universe, the gravitational energy, electrical energy, and inertia. Now, if you go in a car, you want to stop and you want to go. These are the two things. And there's no reason why it should be. And there's no reason why there should be gravity, unless, if you take this absolute and see that through the framework of time and space, how will it look as an apparition, then there must be some signatures of it. And it strikes me that gravity is a signature of wanting to be undivided, and electrical energy is a desire, as it were, to be infinite, stretch out infinitely, and inertia is a desire for unchanging, something unchanging. And so, again, if you postulate even that there's an unchanging and undivided and infinite entity, you would see these signatures in the world if it was apparitional.
Okay. Can I just briefly reply to that?
No, that's fine.
1 minute.
What we're going to do is we're going to open up to questions from that. When you're done, you're
okay. When I'm done,
open up to
okay.
questions.
So if I could just finish off one thing there,
okay.
Because you're looking for a connection.
Yeah.
So how does it affect a worldview? It affects a worldview by virtue of this, that this revelation is only available to the pure mind. It is purely a psychological process. So how will it affect my moral position and so on and so forth? Then I will take every measure to do things in a non-egoistic way, in a selfless way, more than mere morals and ethics. I will take a disciplined measure as recommended. The methodology, fourfold methodology is there depending on your propensity. And with that clarification, purification of the mind, I will discover this reality is the way. Now, there's evidence for it, but we leave it there for the time being.
Right, well, here's the difficulty with that, and this is the difficulty with faith-based discussions of any sort, is once you free yourself, as you have done in this conversation, from the restriction that I place upon myself of proportioning what I say I believe to the available evidence, you can say anything. You know, here's what I can say based on what you're saying. I can say, okay, God is an entity which is non-existence and hatred, and that I have that from my direct experience direct experience that God is non-existence and hatred.
Then I would dispute-
I know you would,
yeah,
and I would dispute yours.
Yeah, no, but can I tell you why I would dispute that?
Well, you can
Carry
tell
on.
me after I finish, because
Yeah, yeah.
you might believe the full thing.
Right.
Okay, that it's this is my reliable testimony, and I believe that every atom in the universe has a desire to be destructive and to decay, and I believe that causes us to me to want to be egotistical and hurtful, and that's based on my direct experience of God being non-existence and hatred. Now, there is as much evidence to support what I've just said as there is to support what you've just said.
Can I ask you?
Other than it is what you're saying is what you want to believe.
Yeah. If I could just briefly respond.
Just nothing brief about this conversation.
Well, this is the atoms going on for eternity.
You see, the problem is that you're presenting a hypothetical thing.
As are you.
No, I'm not. And let's test it out. Is there anybody here who does not want freedom? Anybody?
But that's my point. You're basing it on desire. You're not basing it on evidence.
Okay.
What we will do is we're going to open up to questions, general questions
right.
from the audience from both sides. So,
Okay. Questions?
yeah,
It's very interesting, good luck.
Connor,
Yeah.
and then
Okay, I'll try and stay to the point towards the end of the conversation. This is just a factual point about the ever-expandingness of atoms. Interestingly, for your discussion at least, atoms don't want to expand forever. You've got a positive bit and a negative bit, and they really want to go together. The reason they don't is the uncertainty principle, so maybe go in that direction the next time. The conversation about the uncertainty principle is something else I really don't want to bring up.
Are you certain?
Okay, fine. All right, so my question for Swami, I guess, is does your particular form of Hinduism get more or less esoteric the more physics you get to know? Because, I mean, in the 1930s, we came up with this uncertainty principle to explain a particular phenomenon. And if that phenomenon has been explained with Heisenberg's certainty principle, it doesn't seem like it would be prefigured by any stages at any point in the past.
Well, you have to understand that the pioneers, the fathers, if you like, of quantum physics, all looked to Vedanta. So you find Heisenberg. Heisenberg said in a letter to Friedrich Capra, to Schrödinger, I think it was. Anyway, he said, "This crazy idea of uncertainty. I knew there was crazy ideas in Vedanta, and so he traveled to India to investigate it." So, and Schrödinger was definitely well into the Vedanta philosophy, stating emphatically that consciousness is one. Also, Niels Bohr quoted extensively from the Upanishads. So it seems to me, and of course Oppenheimer quoted openly from the Bhagavad Gita as well, and so on. So it seems to me that there's a compatibility here. And I don't think it's an accident. And I don't forget that the Vedanta was always scientific. It might not have been quantitatively scientific. In fact, it wasn't quantitatively scientific. But having said that, we get the zero from the ancient Hindus. We get the current numerical system from them. We get trigonometry from them. The calculation of the distance from the Earth to the Moon in their calculations was 9 miles out from our current calculations. The diameter of the Earth was about 18 miles out, which in the scheme of things is not a huge amount. So I think there's always been a scientific basis. Now, the search for truth was not just esoteric truth. It wasn't just inner truth. It was truth externally as well, because that's how the match comes. And what I've been trying to do, with great time restrictions, unfortunately, is to show how the apparitional universe that we experience as real is our big mistake. And when we get over that big mistake, we see things as they are. And when we see things as they are, and that requires a system, it requires discipline, it requires hard work. And every religious system will have it. Now, their starting point may well be different, but the fact is it's a question of clarifying and purifying the mind. And when you find it, you get it. Now, this is not just blind faith. It's not blind faith at all, in fact, as was suggested. Not at all. If you take these 3 criteria, and there are actually 6 criteria, we only take these 3, that I experience something. What's the evidence of it? There's a transformation in me. And when that happens, I now relate. It's compatible with logic and reasoning. And I think there's absolute reasoning when I establish what is the fundamental witness. Is there a fundamental witness? What is that? And when I get to that datum beyond which I cannot go, then I've reached this transcendent position, as it were. And then thirdly, if I take the repeatability of it, that is, here is what we experienced. This is exactly what science does. Here's what we experienced. You see, if we talk about the Higgs boson, for example, whoever saw it? Nobody saw it. Do we believe it? I believe it. Why do I believe it? Reliable testimony from those experts who saw a blip on a screen and said, yes, we completed the standard model of particle physics. So this is empirical evidence presented by others. We call it reliable testimony. But the opportunity is always for me to repeat it. I can always go and do it myself. Now, in this case, if I do it myself, I will discover the truth or falsehood of it, whichever. I'll find out, is it true or is it not true? And that's the point.
Okay, can I just briefly respond to that? I mean, look, there's a bit of sleight of hand here. I mean, he's thrown in things like Heisenberg quoted the Vedanta. You know, Neil deGrasse Tyson quoted Star Trek. It doesn't matter who quoted what. Science is based on empirical testing of experiments that are designed to test whether a hypothesis is right. And it doesn't matter who quoted what. It's or who believes what in their private lives. When they're acting as scientists, they're acting as scientists. And so you can either make assertions based on science, in which case you're shackled to all of what science tells us, or you can make subjective assertions based on philosophy and religion. But you can't just pick something out of science, and particularly you can't pick the fact that somebody who is a scientist quoted something that isn't scientific as supporting.
Well, if I could just quote this, Schrödinger, in speaking of a universe in which particles are represented by wave functions, said, the unity and continuity of Vedanta are reflected in the unity and continuity of wave mechanics. This is entirely consistent with the Vedanta concept of all in one. The multiplicity is only apparent. This is the doctrine of the Upanishads, and not of the Upanishads only. The mystical experience of the union with God regularly leads to this view, unless strong prejudices stand in the West. That's Erwin Schrödinger in his What is Life? He says there is no kind of framework within which we can find consciousness in the plural. This is simply something we construct because of the temporal plurality of individuals. But it is a false construction. The only solution to this conflict, insofar as any is available to us at all, lies in the ancient wisdom of the Upanishad.
We're going to take a question. Does anyone have a question for Michael? Yeah.
You mentioned a bit earlier about how you wouldn't go necessarily so far as to assume that the I exists. Could you elaborate on that?
Well, if you take the most common formulation of it, I think, therefore I am. That's in itself logically flawed because it's assuming the I in the I think and using that as a bridge to the conclusion, therefore I am. I think that I'm going to preface every I in this with what seems to be I. Okay, but I'll leave that unspoken. The point that I'm making is that if you're going to go back philosophically to what we can know for certain, I think the answer is we can't know anything. And the reason that I think we can't know anything is not because of the I. That's kind of just a later stage in it. It's because it's because if we think that something is true or is real, if we believe that, what we're essentially saying is what appears to be thinking is consistent with what actually is the case. Okay, so it's something that's going on in my mind, but ultimately my only mechanism at the end of the day for testing the reliability of my mind in figuring out whether what I think is real is also my mind. So you cannot use the same instrument to test the reliability of the same instrument. So that's the reason that I think we can't know anything. It's nothing to do with the content of the beliefs. It's to do with the limited means that we have available to try to test it. And then, so in terms of I, who knows? It may be the case, that consciousness is not an I as in, it's not an I that I'm deciding to pick up that bottle, but it may be that it is something that is noticing that what seems to be my hand is moving over there and picking up that bottle. And indeed there are scientific tests at a kind of a crude stage of that process that show that when you are pressing buttons to choose something or other in a test, that the neurophysiological processes in your brain that are causing your hands to move and press the button have started before you are consciously aware that you are doing that. So it seems to me likely to be, well, I won't go as far as likely, but it seems to me possible to be the case that that consciousness itself, that the consciousness of that free will is an illusion, and that we're just essentially noticing things that are just happening, atoms and gravity interacting to cause things to happen.
If I might comment on that, the language that you're using, you see, is instrumentation. And so I wonder, when you're thinking, is there any observer of the thought process, of what you're thinking, a kind of maybe internal conversation? Is there any witness of that? And if so, who might that be, or what?
Well, okay, here's the simple answer to that is, I don't know, and neither do you. And the difficulty that I have with religions is that they then insert an answer, and they say, well, it's an interesting question, yeah, so it's this. And then build a whole load of things onto that including when you referred earlier on like temples, etc., as being secondary details. They're not secondary details, they're just independent things that happen to be linked onto it for convenience.
Yeah, well, I mean, the idea of secondary details is that it's not the central issue in the discovery of the truth. But the point is this.
They're irrelevant to the truth. What there is that they're mechanisms of social control.
Well, I didn't say irrelevant, I said secondary. But you see, the point is this, they are very relevant. But irrelevant and secondary are different things, different terms. The point is this, there's no assumption here, that's the point. Some entity is observing the processes of thoughts, feelings, and so on and so forth. Your answer to that, I don't know what it is. Now, you may not know what it is, but at least you can assert it's something.
Yeah, absolutely.
We're going to just take, I think we have a question that's been waiting.
I'm a cognitive psychologist, and everything we know about development is that it is in the process of changing, that an organism is a process.
Yeah.
And in particular, when we talk about the internal voice, the inner voice, inner speech as it's often called, and that does seem to have an origin in development. So everything we know about not just the universe, but we just talk about biological development, everything we know about it shows that it's in a constant process of change. A lot of cognitive psychology does take this issue, because it is an issue of the homunculus. If you keep going back, then you end up in an infinite regress, and there's a homunculus inside. If you say there's an homunculus, you don't explain anything.
Yeah.
But your answer seems to be that the homunculus is God, and it does exist, whereas cognitive psychology seems to be saying, well, what we try and do is say that, well, actually we need to have a better level of explanation so we don't get back to the homunculus. So I was just wondering, how can you justify, which is my question, but how can you justify in a biological sense, with reference to quantum mechanics, which
as far as I know, except in some very, very small situations, doesn't impact upon biological systems, and certainly the brain of that, it doesn't impact in a meaningful way. How can we justify that there is something that's permanent and unchanging? Everything we know about development says quite the opposite.
Okay, you brought up quite a few things. One of the things you brought up was what we might call tangled hierarchy. You see, the cognitive behaviorism and this system, these are two separate things, really. When you deal with the one on one level, my only point is this: things are observed. When things happen in terms of emotions, feelings, and thoughts, there's some entity that observes it. If it wasn't like that, and if it was the nature of the observer to be the mind and to be changing, we could never change anything. And so the behavior itself could never change.
Sorry, can you justify that last bit?
Well, yes, if I want to move this bottle, I have to be separate from it.
I don't see how that justifies what you said.
If I want to change an internal behavior, if I want to change a pattern, a habit, then I, something separate, must have the determination to do it and also the capacity to do it.
Yeah, I'm not following how that follows from what you're saying.
Right. Anyway, so that's it. So if you deal with it purely from a psychological level, and only do that, but at least on that level, you'll assert that behavior can and should be changed. At least that much you'd see.
Right. I think we have a question just here.
You wouldn't just leave it, would you? You know, all the psychotherapists would be out of business, isn't it?
Well, I mean, what you're saying, it's unchanging. I mean, that the observer is unchanging.
The ultimate observer, yes.
My point is the observer doesn't.
The ultimate observer would be unchanging. Yeah. The great in-depth philosophical argument on this would be that consciousness expresses itself in three states. So we don't have just the waking state; we also have dream and dreamless sleep.
Do you think there was any change in the universe before consciousness evolved?
And so there must be an observer, independent of these three states, which is able to recall, I did this yesterday, I had this dream, and this was peaceful.
Do you think there were any changes in the universe before consciousness evolved?
Well, you see, consciousness does not evolve.
Well, before consciousness existed.
Consciousness always existed.
Well,
you see.
What's your basis for saying that? Other than that you have you any evidence that you can offer me that doesn't depend on your subjective religious beliefs that consciousness has always existed?
Yeah, there's no subjective religious beliefs here.
There is now, in fairness.
In absolute fairness, there is not. The Advaita system does not acknowledge anything like that.
No, but it is subjective, because if it wasn't subjective, then everybody would have the same religious beliefs.
No, this is a monistic system, and the difference in religious beliefs and so on and so forth are differences in approaches and interpretations and languages.
Okay, well,
there's no single language.
What do you mean mistaken in your interpretation of it?
In my interpretation of what?
Of everything. Anything. What should be mistaken in all the things you're saying to
Well, no, because it passed the currency of reliable testimony.
It's not possible that you might be mistaken.
It's not possible because it passes the currency of reliable testimony. It can pass the currency of individual experience, and it passes the currency of rationale.
Yeah, but in your opinion it does. But is it possible that you might be mistaken that it passes all those tests?
No.
We're going to take a question just here.
Okay,
absolutely.
Well, that's settled then.
Go on.
You were talking about freedom and every bit of existence moves for freedom.
Yeah.
Somebody else now, it's so manipulative question, does my hand, part of me, yearn for freedom?
Well, here you're confusing parts with identities.
No.
Well, it's like
I'm saying you said that all matter yearns for freedom.
Yeah, no, it's a bit like saying, does the wheel of the car yearn to move?
No, it's not.
No, but the composite of car and driver wants it, isn't it?
No, the car doesn't want anything.
Yeah.
You claim that all of reality, including my matter, yearns for freedom. And I was just curious if my bits of me that aren't directly, that are attached to my mind, are also part of that, separate from my mind.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. Freedom from what? You need to be free from something.
Well, how are we bound? First of all, we're not free from pain. We're not free from the vicissitudes of life.
Yeah.
What?
Why would you want to be free from pain? Isn't that subjective? Maybe you might like pain.
Oh, okay.
Can
Well, can I ask a question?
There are people who like pain.
Well, can I ask a question? Is there anybody here whose goal is unhappiness?
Could I ask, why should a table or this bench
Yeah,
want to be free of pain? Because pain is a personal concept.
yeah,
It's an emotion.
yeah,
The bench doesn't have an emotion.
yeah, I agree.
So how can it be free from pain?
Well, you see, this freedom aspect comes from the evolved aspect of a person.
But you
So
said
what-
matter, you said all matter.
Yes, well, allow me a little poetic license. See, the point is, I was referring to electrical energy that wants to fly off.
It doesn't
No.
want to do anything.
Well, it doesn't, of course it doesn't want to do anything.
Well, then why do you say that it does? I mean, let's use words that mean what they say.
Yeah. Well, I will assert want, actually. I'll use that word because, you see, there's an argument which might say, even a table, is it sentient or insentient? Is a rock sentient or insentient? Does a rock know, and I'm using license here, language license, does a rock know where the center of the earth is? Does a surveyor use that in his surveying using a plumb line? So when we say that the universe is insentient, many of the schools of Vedanta philosophy postulated that the universe as we know it is insentient, completely insentient. But you see, if the understanding is that consciousness is there and there's an apparition, then it will come out as it were in a reflection. And the example used really is the snake, the rope, the apparitional aspect of it. So in an apparitional universe, you would expect signatures coming through, and we find it.
We have a question just at the back there.
Just on my critique of saying my hand wants to be free, I mean, it's not like corruption of language, because ultimately language is an imperfect representation of how we view the universe. I mean, when you're critiquing the Hinduist stance on the basis of understanding freedom from a more subjective experience, you're not actually understanding that language itself is only a compromise between trying to understand the more fundamental nature of things. Since we can only understand the true human experience, certain contradictions will only arise within language that wouldn't arise within a perfect system. So that the hand being free or an atom wanting freedom, I mean, freedom can mean like not being restrained. In that respect, it is correct to say that an atom desires some level of freedom. I mean, the nucleus of an atom is held together by weak nuclear forces. So in that respect, it is trying to be free of a restraint, just not in respect to a human kind of freedom.
Said much better than myself. Thank you.
Yeah, well, yeah, but still not said well enough. It's because you're mixing metaphors with descriptions, and when you say that an atom wants to do anything, you can say it as a metaphor, or you can say it as you described earlier on as poetic language. But what you've got to do in a conversation like this is be clear which you're using, and don't just mix them up together. And don't just say, for example, as you were saying earlier, don't just say, does a wheel want to move of a car? No, it doesn't. Well, then the combination of the wheel and the driver wants to move. No, it doesn't. The driver may want to move, but the wheel doesn't. Yeah. But what you've been doing tonight a few times, I've noticed, is you'll make these kind of hypotheses that are kind of murky. I don't mean murky in a derogatory. That are kind of ambiguous at the start of something, and then you'll start building a whole load of things on it, on the assumption that the earlier thing is true. And so by the time that I come to trying to tease out what you're talking about, that there's so much built on the original assumption that I need to challenge that it's difficult to follow.
Well, I mean, the original assumption I made is I exist. Now, can we test it? Well, if we work on that basis and find out what that I is, and the final conclusion of realization is I exist, then there's the proof, there's the evidence. But the idea is it's repeatable. So everybody says, here's the formula, do it. Now the problem is, people don't want to do it. So the problem is, if this were the laboratory, in this case the laboratory of the mind, because we view that all religion is essentially, in methodology, a psychological process. But if we say that we engage in the psychological process, which is refining the mind and refining its purity, because this is only accessible to people pure of mind, then it's not to be done overnight. It's a bit like saying I'll climb Mount Everest. Well, what do you need to do? Well, I may have to train for 2 years. I may have to get the right equipment. I may have to do some altitude testing. There are all kinds of things I may have to do. And so this is discipline, and every religion has it. So every religion, thrust on discovering the same thing, will need its own discipline, its own systems of training, and it's primarily psychological training. And self-discipline is psychological training. Now, when the mind is trained well, and we've gone through all methodologies that are prescribed, then we can assert whether it's true or not. And this was the technique of Buddha, because Buddha was wise enough not to say, there is this. When asked, is there a God or not God, the great silent Shakyamuni, silent one of the Shakya clan, remained silent. And people thereafter interpreted it, no, that's not God, but that's not what he meant. Clearly, because his first declaration was, I am enlightened. So a positive experience took place, a transcendent experience took place. Now, it's a bit like saying, if I describe going from here to Galway, tell me what is Galway like, never having been.
I was there last night. It's terrible.
Well,
I might well say, well, wait, no matter how much I describe Galway, and if you've never been, why don't I just say, here's the road, and find out for yourself what's at the end of it. And that's pretty much the methodology. So, again, the phrase in the Upanishads say, the mind comes back together with the senses, but test it out for yourself and see whether it's true or not. But, of course, you won't get it from an intellectual understanding no more than you'll understand what a toothache is, knowing the neurology of the mouth and the process of mechanics of tooth decay, and the sweet things will provide it, and the bacteria will be there, and so on and so forth. If you get the toothache itself, you'll have experienced it. So it's only through that experience that you'll find it out. Armchair philosophy won't do it.
I think we're going to move on to the closing speeches now.
Okay.
So they're 7 minutes each, and Swami, would you like to go first?
Yes, well, I think in summary, how would I summarize all this? That's an interesting thing. I didn't really prepare for something, to be honest. But anyway, let's try and cobble this thing together. I began by defining a God. This is not the extra-cosmic God that we find in Abrahamic religions, and to that extent, from the Abrahamic religion point of view, would be atheistic. But from a point of view that there's an absolute which has no distinguishing characteristics, and that is seen through the framework from the human perspective, the highest reading of the mind would be the personal God of religion. Just as a sun would be defective as seen as reflected in water due to ripples and what have you, so the reflection that we call God is not as clear, not as perfect, but yet directly experienced still, because it's still a phenomena of the mind. It's still a phenomena of the human reading of the absolute. On top of that, in order to get to grips with this, knowing that there's an ideal out there, we also can manufacture a God. This manufactured God is the God of most religions, and so it's an exaggerated human being. On the other hand, materialists, material atheists, in other words, it's not like material in the sense of material girl and all that. It's materialism in the sense that material is the only thing that exists. Matter, energy is the only thing that exists. Now, if that's the point of view, then, and we didn't really, although you brought the subject up about morality, we didn't really go into it at all, but then make hay while the sun shines would be a reasonable philosophy. But we don't find it. So, in terms of materialism, all we have then is uncertainty in matter and nothing fixed and nothing to observe it either. So the emphasis is on the objective and not the subjective. But yet when we see things and perceive things, what we perceive is two things. We perceive the objective entity that we are acknowledging, and there's also a simultaneous perception of a subjective observer. That subjective observer in relation to the changing field must be unchanging, naturally. It must be undivided because there's division everywhere. And it is pure consciousness. Why? Because it's a knower. It knows what's in front. Now we could then ask an interesting question. Are there many knowers? As many people here, are there that many knowers? And the answer is no. And Schrödinger endorsed this view that a consciousness is one out of necessity. The consciousness is one out of necessity because it relates to existence, and we can't have multiple existences. The existence must be one. But we have to separate these views. There's a relative view of a changing world. The scientific term in the ancient days was jagat. That means the thing that always changes. There's only one way to know that something changes. There has to be something that is unchanging. Something static observes something that is moving. This is not an assumption, it's common sense apart from anything else. If I see an objective bottle, I'm clearly different and separate from it. And so there are multiple fields in front which I can observe. And in comparison to that, I do not change. There's a datum like that beyond which we cannot go. If it wasn't like that, then I could not observe the changes going on in the intellect field. We couldn't observe this summary thing called I, the ego. We couldn't observe anything going on in the mental field and beyond. And all these multiple fields are simultaneously observed by a single observer. Now, what is the nature of that observer? I'll access it through discipline. I'll access it through peeling away all those multiple layers until I get to that one entity beyond which I cannot go. At that point, I will be able to declare to you that this is existent. But beyond that, I take it as I was going to say for granted, but I take it provisionally. So I can take it provisionally to be true, just as any scientific hypothesis, and then I'll investigate through the laboratory method, using psychology, to find out what is exactly that entity. Once I have found it, how will I know? I'll know because there's a registered transformation. There's certain criteria. First of all, I'll be interested in altruistic love for everybody, regardless. That doesn't mean just golden rule or anything like that. It means no sense of self. In other words, I'll have transcended the genetic directive. Two genetic directives. One, streaming negative entropy on myself, eating, drinking, sleeping. And secondly, I'll have transcended the necessity for the genetic necessity to propagate the species. If I take this just as successful criteria, these two things, then these great personages that inspire us, Jesus, Buddha, Ramakrishna, and so on, they would have been utmost failures. And yet, we find their legacy living for thousands of years. So, how do we resolve this question? Do the experiment. That's the only way to resolve it. That's the only proof that we've got. And so I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Okay, again, you have freed yourself from the requirement that I impose upon myself of only saying things that are proportionate to the evidence and only believing things that are proportionate to the evidence. You've come up with a theory, I don't mean you personally have come up with a theory, but you've come up with a theory that may well be internally consistent, although I would dispute even some parts of that, but that may well be internally consistent, but that has no necessary relationship with reality. And what you have also said, and this is the sort of most worrying thing that you've said tonight, is that it's not possible that you might be mistaken. I think it's really important that I'm always happy to say that I might be mistaken about anything. It might be the case that what you're talking about is true. I don't think it is, but I'm open to the possibility that it is, and if I get evidence that it is, then I will change my mind and adopt the position that you're outlining. But if you start from a position of saying that it's not possible that you might be mistaken, then you're closing yourself off to potentially new knowledge that could change your mind if you were open to it. The other 2 points I just want to reflect on for a second, because when you refer to atheistic materialism leading to a morality of make hay, etc., that's not where atheistic materialism would lead you if you follow the evolution of morality. Like, we are social animals, and as social animals we have evolved properties in our brains that include things like empathy and compassion and cooperation and reciprocity and fairness and justice. And these are things that are useful evolutionarily, because cooperation is as important as competition in the survival mechanisms of the most suitable or the entities that fit most effectively into the environment. So it's not the case that morality, that atheistic materialistic morality is purely self-centered, and I would argue the opposite, that religious morality corrupts our natural sense of morality by encouraging people to do things that are that cause unnecessary suffering on the basis that they think the creator of the universe is telling them to do that. Now, it's obviously not something that we have time to go into, but since just the morality thing was mentioned. So I'll go back to my earlier thing. I think we should believe things proportionally to the currently best available evidence, while remaining open to the possibility that we might be mistaken. I think we should therefore be cautious in what we believe, and I think that the claims about the existence of gods, unless you're going to redefine it into something that's kind of just that we already have words for, is making an unnecessary and unjustified leap in terms of what we can claim to believe. It's certainly an interesting theory to look at and say, this might be interesting if it was the case, and who knows, it might be the case, but absent the evidence that is available to everybody, not just available to direct experience, because direct experience is the worst form of testimony for something. If you have a car crash and you have 10 people watching it, you get 10 different descriptions of what happened. There are people who directly believe that they're Napoleon Bonaparte, and they're not. Direct experience is the worst way of determining what reality is. In order to determine our best estimated guess as to what reality is, we've got to try and come up with mechanisms that are available to everybody independently of our individual direct experiences. And the best method that we've had to date on that by far is the scientific method. So I would suggest that unless you're going to redefine God into something that is either another word for something else, or flexible enough in meaning to just adapt to whatever, in which case it's an unnecessary hypothesis to introduce, I would suggest that there is no rational reason to believe that a God exists, and on that basis I would ask you to oppose the motion. Thank you very much.